Thank you very much, and I feel I'm humble and honored standing before you and putting my ideas on that. I'm not an expert, and as Michael was saying, probably I know something about the subject. Expert is when I go to my grave, not before that. I thought that I have a long time to go there, but probably Michael wants to send me quickly. When I say engagement, we all know that India is much more actively involved with the Middle East than any time in the past, and it spreads both in it is not only political, it is economic, strategic, energy, and whole range of issues. What is more interesting, India's policy now, that is in the post-Cold War, than before, was that it is less rhetorical. And I often think Jesus Christ must be a Indian, because we are very fond of sermonizing others. And if you look at the way in which India behaved during the Cold War, we almost, on every occasion, this should be done, that should be done, we no longer do that. And not because that we made a fundamental transition into being a nice guys, but basically we recognize our limitations. And with the result, you will find that during the Cold War, our policies are basically political, in the sense anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, third world solidarity. These were the only means we were trying to promote our interests in the Middle East. And today it's no longer a viable proposition. You need to have much more than words to convey or to communicate your interests. I think that is what's happening in the last 10 years or so, when your relations with these countries are manifested through tangible decisions and policies and actions that India has taken in the last 15 years or so. And it is in that context I use the word engagement. Detachment is probably because we understand our limitations, that when you promote a relations with one set of countries and it is in conflict with another one. So therefore there comes a point you are forced to take a choice or take a side, and we are not in a position to do that. And I think that is what I'm saying. On the one hand, we are willing to collaborate and cooperate with a whole range of countries. There comes a point when we do not want to get involved in the problems that these countries have with some of the neighbors and others. So at one level, you want a closer relationship with these countries. At other level, you don't want to get sucked into their problems with the outside world. I think that is why it's a very peculiar development, largely because you do not have the power to change events, and therefore it is better you don't even get involved in that. And that is how I see the India's Middle East policy. And the first and foremost we should remember is that Middle East is more important to India than vice versa. Let there be no mistake on that. India is still a marginal player in the Middle East, in every sense of the word: political, economic, military, strategic. The converse is not true. If you look at the trade figures as of March last year, we don't know what's going to be this year. We all know from in every other part of the world. And at least till last year, Middle East played a dominant role. Our overall foreign trade was something like $400 billion, out of which $100 billion was with the Middle East. In other words, Middle East contributes 25% of our total trade, export, imports put together. And if you look at in terms of domestic politics, if we exclude the immediate South Asian region, Middle East is the most dominant foreign policy discourse in India, as manifested by the controversy surrounding normalization of relations with Israel and now the tension with Iran on the other hand. So if you look at it, Middle East is more important to us than other way around. It is economically important in terms of trade. It is important in terms of energy. If you look at the Indian energy market, in the 1980s, we were actually taking care of 2/3 of our energy needs through domestic production. Today, the picture is the opposite. Nearly 2/3 of our energy comes from outside. If you look at any assessment, whether it's the Government of India, International Energy Agency, or the Energy Department of the US, everybody agree on one thing, that is by 2020, 80% or more energy of India will be met only by imports. At least in that front, that is, in terms of energy dependence, I'm in the league with Japan. I can't compete with Japan in other areas, at least as far as energy dependence is concerned. Yes, guys, I'm also in your club. Take me as a member. And something which I can't do in other areas. And the third thing, if you look at it, we have a substantial Indian expatriate population. We have about 5 million people as of last year, and bulk of them were in the Arab Gulf, the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf region. The remittance is enormous, anything between $25 to $30 billion annually, which is substantial. You have a 500,000 population, and the dependence in India, you have a huge economic linkages between the two. And in terms of geostrategic consideration, Middle East is much closer, and you have all sorts of problems associated with that. And if you look at most of the problems which dominate today are one way or another related to the Middle East, whether it's a situation in Iraq, or the nuclear problems in Iran, or the problem of piracy in the Somalian coast. So all the Middle East gets attention for all the wrong reasons, all bad reasons. And you no longer look Middle East as the citadel of the 3 ancient religions. Today it's known for all the wrong reasons. Everything that goes wrong, you can always find it in the Middle East. So Middle East is more important for us than other way around. How are we handling it? Let me take 3 broad issues and then examine our policies, how we are handling or managing these issues. If one looks at the Arab countries, largely the Arab countries and the Persian Gulf are extremely important to us. Even though we talk Arab in a much general term, it is the Persian Gulf which takes a dominant place. Our expatriate labor is predominantly located in the Persian Gulf countries. There are few in Libya, but bulk of them were in the Persian Gulf countries. And our trade, for instance, with Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates is more than $50 billion. It looks funny, actually. In United Arab Emirates, the total population is 500,000. But the Indian trade with these guys are $23 billion. So therefore, it is an enormous economic interest between these two countries. And with the result, the Arab countries have always been important to us. In the Cold War times, we tried to promote our relationship by playing up the Palestinian card, saying that we are pro-Arab because we are a pro-Palestinian, therefore you have to be nice to us. And it is within that context we try to develop our relations with the Persian Gulf. And we continue to do that even though the Palestinian question has taken a backseat in the last few years. So what has happened is, if you look at India's interaction with these countries, both economic and political, it has been extensive for the last 15 years or so. Every major leader in the Persian Gulf were in India at some time or the other. You have a much stronger, vibrant relationship which is less political, less polemical, less rhetorical. The second country which you should look at is Iran. It is both good and bad. In India, people often talk about civilizational links with Iran. If you think civilization began in 1991, I have no problems with that. But if you look at, seriously speaking, civilization was rarely a factor in Indo-Iranian relationship. It's very nice to know that the language of the princely state of Hyderabad was Persian. We have a long historical linkages in terms of culture, in terms of architecture, everything is fine. But where they transformed into political relationship, they are not. If you look at from 1947 till 1980, under the Shah, we had a problem in the form of Cold War, which means Shah was pro-United States, we were pro-Russian, so therefore there is very little convergence of interest. So the kind of military relationship Shah developed with CENTO and Seattle and everything, we were nothing in common with them. So the Shah's decision for Indian Ocean being an Iranian ocean, and all these things simply kept Shah at a distance. We had relations with Iran, we had normal relationship with Iran, but it was never close. And then you had a Pakistani factor to that. Pakistan being a friend of Iran also complicated the matter for us. In the Islamic Republic of Iran after 79, you had a different sets of problems. With all the differences, both the Congress party and the BJP talk about secularism. For the BJP, secularism is good, but what the Congress is doing is a pseudo-secularism. So they are fighting over the definition of secularism, not the substance of need for a secularism as a framework for Indian policy. So if you look at India as a secular country, what do we have in common with an Islamic republic? Ideologically speaking, there is nothing. On the other hand, India had a lot of things common with Iraq, especially under Saddam Hussein. It may be very unpleasant to recognize that India and Iraq had a lot of things in common than most people recognize that. The Ba'athist party was much closer to the Congress party, and its secular Arab nationalism was much in common with the Indian view of secularist worldview. With the result, you never had a kind of tension between India and Iraq. And Iraq supported us on the question of Pakistan. Iraq supported us with regard to oil prices after the oil crisis. So with the result, you have a whole range of convergence of interests between India and Iraq during the Cold War and even after 1979. With the result, India never condemned who was responsible for the Iran-Iraq war. This is one of the grudges Ayatollah Khomeini had against India. Everybody knew that Iraq was an aggressor, but you never said it. Which is rather surprising, because if you look at Indian behavior, we were one of the first countries to condemn Israel every time. In 1967, we said Israeli aggression in May, 3 weeks before the war actually started. So that is how we were I think we had a foresight in recognizing who is an aggressor before everything starts. But when it comes to Iran-Iraq war, we couldn't do that because Iraq was our friend. And that friendship went to a very unusual levels in 1990. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, India more or less accepted the Iraqi invasion, occupation in Kuwait. How do I say that? In August, we shut down our embassy in Kuwait and told our diplomats, go to Baghdad. I don't think any other country could have done that, and we did that. Why? Because Iraq was our traditional friend, and therefore we simply could not or did not want to antagonize. Similarly, in 1982, Iraq was supposed to host the Non-Aligned Summit. And a lot of countries were not willing to come to Baghdad because of the ongoing war. So what did Mrs. Gandhi do? Let me host a summit. So the summit in Iraq was shifted to New Delhi, and India hosted it in 1983. So you had a lot of interest baggage which brought India closer to Iraq. With the result, from 1947 till 1990, Iran was a country, a friendly relationship. It was never a close, cordial friendship that India had with the Arab world. Put it other way around. When it comes to Arab and non-Arab country, in the entire Middle East, India always sided with the Arabs. Whether it's a question of Arabs versus Turkey, or Arabs versus Iran, or Arab versus Israel. Because it is with the Arab world you had a much larger, tangible relationship. Therefore, if you are pushed to a situation, India always sides with a non-Arab country because that is where its interests lie. It was only after 91 you had a shift in India's policy towards Iran. Few things happened. End of the Cold War, which basically meant you lost Saddam Hussein. So you needed someone with whom you could deal with, who was a major player in India's Middle East policy. Iraq was doing that role after Nasser. So if you look at from 1950 to till 1970, Nasser was our major partner in the entire Middle East. Once Nasser was out of the scene, Sadat could not do that, carry on that job. So therefore, Iraq became the player with whom we had a major interaction. But after Kuwait, Iraq was removed. Iraq was removed politically, Iraq was removed even in terms of energy. And we needed a player who could deal with us at a much larger level. Similarly, Iran was also undergoing a change. Khomeini has died. Iran wanted a reconciliation with the outside world. It was only in the late 1980s Iran was making a fundamental shift towards the outside world. The confrontation was over, the export of revolution was over, they were willing to reconcile with the Arab countries. If you look at it today, it may look like a joke, but the 1980s were dominated by Salman Rushdie controversy. Towards the end, they quietly resolved it through mutual, everyone had their own interpretation, they resolved the problem. Iran took the step of reconciling with Saudi Arabia. So it was behaving in the sense much more normal fashion. So from the late 80s onwards, Iran reconciled with the outside world with two notable exceptions. One was Israel, with whom it had a historical religious baggage, so therefore Iran could never overcome that. Probably it thought that the raison d'etre of the revolution lies in taking an anti-Israeli position. So therefore the reconciliation never happened. The second was United States. There were ups and downs, there were movements, but the reconciliation never happened. But otherwise, if you look at today's Iran, Iran has reconciled with the entire outside world with the exception of Israel and the United States. So Iran was friendly towards neighbor, especially towards its Arab neighbor, which made things a lot easier for India. So India was looking for a friend, Iran was looking for a friend. It is in that context the Indo-Iranian relationship started developing. If you look at all the major state visits which took place, they all began after 91. First, Narasimha Rao goes to Iran, then Rafsanjani comes to India. Then Vajpayee goes to Iran, then Khatami comes to India, and last year we hosted for a very brief time, Ahmadinejad was passing through India on the way back from Sri Lanka. So all the developments took place only after 1991, not before that. And Iran played a number of roles. Iran was important because we had an identical views on a number of issues. Even for the Iranians, Taliban was an extreme. So therefore, there was an interest. We were anti-Taliban. There was a convergence of interest. Both the countries cooperated on supporting Northern Alliance. So Iran being a major player in the OAC means I have someone to talk to in the OAC against Pakistan. So you have a whole range of convergence. Gradually you had Iran being an axis to Central Asia. These are the political developments. Then you have an economic ones. And Iran needed Indian market. Because when you talk about energy security, it operates at two levels. One, the countries importing energy need assured supply of energy. Similarly, those who are exporting energy also need an assured market. One without the other won't work. So therefore, Iran needed Indian market. But India also needed Iran. Because if you look at Iran, Iran is the only country which has both natural gas and petroleum. Other guys have only one or the other. Iran has advantage of being both. So therefore, Iran had a large energy resources. And India needed that in a much significant fashion. Because if you look at 91 onwards, our energy demands increased, so you needed long-term energy arrangement. So Iran became a major player if India were to look at long-term energy needs. But all the energy needs that India had with Iran had a problem. Whether you talk about LNG, whether you talk about IPI, or whether you talk about India's energy exploration in Iran, all of them are problematic in some form or the other. The pipeline was never given a serious thought until 2003. The idea came in late 1980s, people talked about it, academics discussed it, but it never became an Indian policy because of the fear over Pakistan. In 2003, the government of India said, okay, Pakistan is not a major problem, part of the Lahore process, therefore let's deal with this. Only then it became a viable proposition. And if you look at it, it was only after that US began to notice the energy link between India and Iran, not before that. Because pipeline gives you a different dynamics. India importing X amount of oil from a country doesn't bother the United States. But the moment you bring in a pipeline, it is a much larger, tangible, strategic form of relationship. And that is where US began to play a much active role in opposing that. And the second thing was LNG. Under the deal, Iran was supposed to supply 5 million tons of LNG every year. The problem was Iran doesn't have an LNG technology. So you sign a deal hoping that the Indian counterpart will somehow find an energy using its influences in the West. It never happened. So therefore, LNG deal is almost written in good faith, didn't carry out. And the third one is exploration. Exploration is basically aimed at having an energy assets abroad. India's intention was you explore an oil, you have a large quantity of oil, either you can swap it with a third party or bring it to India. That was the old rationale of exploration. And it is in that context India has indulged in a whole range of energy exploration markets. We have invested over $2 billion in Russia, same amount in Sudan, and we are exploring energy in a whole range of countries. Burma or Myanmar, Syria, Egypt, Nigeria, you name it. You have a whole range. But none of them draw international attention. Why? Nice guys finish last. If you're a nasty guy, you get the headlines. Whether you deliver or not, you get the maximum attention no matter what is the financial implications of the relationship. So Iran got the maximum attention even though Indian oil companies could never bring these discovered oil to India. Indian companies would at best be given a percentage of money for their activities, not in terms of energy assets. So if you look at it seriously, all the energy deals are a problem. At the same time, the much more serious problem came in the form of United States. Because US had a problem with Iran on two fronts. One, the energy front. The other one was the nuclear one. And it is the nuclear one which got us into much more serious problems. Because having gone nuclear, India cannot ask other guys, please don't go that way. We don't have the moral authority to do that. At the same time, you can't say more the merrier. Because the moment you say it, your monopoly goes. So you are in a very, very tight corner. So what India did was, Iran should resolve its differences within the IAEA, which is a very technical and very safe game to play, because you made a commitment, live up to that. And it is in that context we navigated the policy. And that was also not very smartly handled, as we know in the IAEA voting. So in the sense, if you look at the second voting, we voted against Iran, and the official statement was pro-Iran. We gave an impression that India was supporting Iran. Unless you look at the voting picture, it's the other way around. So we messed it up, but the logic was this. Iran's position was increasingly become untenable. No matter what Russia and China say in private or in public, look at the voting behavior. It is ultimately that is what matters. Because Iran said, Iran is a peaceful intention, everything, then why did you vote with the United States both in IAEA and United States Security Council? Because if you look at IAEA, in the first vote, Russia and China abstained. Second vote, they voted with the rest of the majority. If you look at the United Security Council, all the 5 occasions, they voted with the United States. And US also took that walk, because they could have got a much harsher resolutions, much more effective resolution, but they recognized that would have been opposed or vetoed. So therefore, US was willing to dilute the resolution, but they conveyed one simple message, 15-0. That is the message US wanted to convey to Iran. So no matter what Russia and China said, eventually they went with the United States. I think that is what India recognized. In the sense, on the nuclear question, you got into trouble. It's an entirely different story that we completely mishandled the whole equation. Because you wanted a civilian nuclear cooperation with the United States and energy security from Iran. But we eventually did not convince either of the parties. We mishandled. We will go it if anyone is interested. But the most interesting thing for us is the Arab-Israeli question. And I think that is what is going to is tell us how India has been shaping its policy towards the region, and I would say more than the Persian and the Arab component. It is on the Arab-Israeli question, India has handled it reasonably well. I think they were able to articulate their positions without actually saying so in so many words. If you look at the Indian policy, largely towards Israel, till 92, it never had a diplomatic relations. From 1920 till 1992, you approach the whole question through a zero-sum game approach. You wanted to be pro-Palestinian, pro-Arab, which naturally meant you taking an anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish, or anti-Zionist positions. In 1920 onwards, Indian nationalists identified with the Palestinian Arab positions. Part of the problem is because you looked at the whole question through an Islamic prism. Because that is why you never recognize why a group of people strongly feel about a land where they left 2,000 years ago. You can say it's right and wrong, that's a different story. But the question is, first recognize the longing or a sense of attachment towards the land. That is a reality. Whether you agree, disagree, approve, disapprove, that's all secondary point. India never understood why a group of people wanted a homeland in Palestine. They never understood the logic of it. So therefore, why? Because you never looked at it. If you look at the Indian writings, Jazirat al-Arab, the land of Arabia, included Palestine. If you look at the Middle East context, they never included Palestine into that concept. It was Indians who argued it. If you look at Mahatma Gandhi, was more honest than most of the Indians, actually said Palestine is a Waqf property. Prophet Muhammad promised to them, therefore they cannot take it away. And even said that in the First World War, Muslim soldiers of the Indian army did not shed blood to hand over Palestine to non-Muslim control. Okay, Indians talked in secular terms. It was Gandhi who said it bluntly. Palestine is an Islamic question, therefore I need to support the Arabs, Palestinian position, not the Jewish-Israeli position. So we continued that until the end. In 1947, when the bulk of the world was talking about partitioning Palestine, India said, no, federal Palestine. It's a good idea. The only problem was, Mahatma Gandhi said the same thing to India. Have a federal India with Jinnah as a prime minister. Nehru said, no, thank you very much. And that is the great hypocrisy. You think that the federal solution is good for Palestine, something which you can't do in India. The funny part is, in Palestine, communist parties, there are two communist parties. Communists, we talked about ideology transcending boundaries, could not find one platform that would unite Jews and Arabs. And therefore, in 1947, the only issue in which the Arabs and the Jews agreed was to reject the Indian federal plan. And they never agreed on anything else. On this one, they said, thank you very much, we don't want it. For the Arabs, it offered the Jews too much or more than what the Jews deserve. For the Zionists, it says, I was asking for sovereignty, you give me civil rights. So with the result, for the Arabs, it was too much, for the Jews, it was too little, therefore they rejected it outright. Until today, the Indian federal plan was never discussed anywhere outside India. Only in India, people talk it's a wonderful plan, it would have solved all the problems. Then you ask a question, if it is so good, why both sides rejected it? These are uncomfortable questions, so don't ask it. So in 1948, in 47, when the partition came, India was one of the very few non-Muslim countries to vote against Palestine, to partition of Palestine. In 49, when in 48 Israel came into reality, you can't ignore it. But still in 49, when Israel applied for the UN membership, you said no. That's one of the very few occasions India voted against a country's admission into the United Nations. In spite of all the things, you cannot ignore the reality. So 1950, you said, okay, I recognize Israel. If you look at the official records in 1950, there were explicit decisions that we will have full, normal diplomatic relations with resident missions in both countries. Nehru actually asked the ministry to prepare a budget for a resident mission in Tel Aviv. When Israeli diplomat Walter Yatan came to India in 1952 March, Nehru told him, yes, we will have relations, but we are in the middle of an election. Once the elections are over, we will have a cabinet, we will ratify it, we will send the ambassador. We did send ambassador 40 years later. In 1956, after the Suez crisis, Nehru said, time is not ripe. He was angry at the Israeli action. Not because of the Israeli invasion of Egypt, no. So many third world countries invade other countries, they even absorb them, swallow them, whatever it is. That's not a problem for him. For him the problem was Ben-Gurion collaborated with the British and the French, who still had an imperial interest, who were still imperial power, who were still behaving in an imperial fashion. Therefore it was unacceptable to him. So in 1956 he said no, that continued. By then you also had Nehru-Nasser friendship. Between 1954 to 1964, when Nehru died, both leaders met as many as 14 times. So every time Nehru used to go to Europe, he will make a stopover in Cairo, and both the leaders will take a cruise along the Nile. And they exchange hours together. So that had an enormous influence on India's Israel policy. And this continued till 1992. And it reached its nadir, its lowest point in 1975, when India joined hands with the rest of the world, or rest of the third world, to say that Zionism was racism. And that's the lowest point you could go on the bilateral front. In 1992, the world changed because you recognize Soviet Union disappeared. Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries provided the ideological basis of India's Israel policy. They were not responsible, but ideologically it proved politically correct to say that, okay, you're anti-Israeli, pro-Arab. And that can be seen even today in my campus. Every time there is a student union elections, people fight as if you think that Sharon or Olmert or Bush are going to fight elections. Because that is what you see on the posters. Because I can't solve the problems of hostels, water, library facilities, computers, network, tuition fees. No, I can't solve them. So let me solve the problems of the Gaza, problems in Venezuela, problem in Nicaragua. Okay, I can't solve that, I can't solve this. But you won't ask me to solve the problem, right? But if I promise you water and everything, you'll ask me next year what happened. You promise yes next year. So therefore, it is still there. It is politically correct, it is politically fashionable to take the left attitude. And that is why if you look at it, while the left was not responsible, it provided the ideological basis for the long absence of relations with Israel. In 1992, Soviet Union disappeared. So you don't have anybody to go. So you need to come to terms with certain basic realities. And the most interesting thing was, the Arabs were willing to talk to Israelis. So the Madrid process did not achieve anything. But it told us one thing, you need a political settlement. Political settlement means negotiations. Negotiation is give and take. So you won't get everything. So if Arafat is willing to talk to the Israelis, either directly or as a joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation, what is my problem? Why should I be more Catholic than the Pope? And therefore India recognized, okay, there is no base because I don't have a bilateral problem with Israel. My problem is partly because this is what the Arabs are saying, okay, my interest was with the Arabs, therefore I should do it. So in that context, the basis of the policy completely changed. And that is how you have a normalization in 1992. But it also told us one thing. The zero-sum approach completely vanished. You recognize it is possible and it is necessary to have good relations with both sides to the conflict. What was the greatest contribution of the Russians to the Arab-Israeli conflict? Breaking of relations in 67. Then what did you do? From 67 to 91, you're nowhere. You simply abandon your role. So if you're learning from something, even if I disagree with something, if I have to be taken seriously, at least I should be talking to both sides, or at least giving an impression that I am balanced. So the balance became the basis of India's Israel policy after 92. It doesn't mean I abandon everyone. No. We'll come to that a little later. But the idea was you have established a balance in dealing with the Middle East. Since then, you have an enormous relationship between the two countries, political, economic, and everything. You have high-level visits. The climax was 2003 when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon comes to Delhi. And if you look at it, at that time, Belgium was actually talking about war crime trial against the Prime Minister. Not many Western countries are willing to host him. In spite of all the protests and everyone, India simply had a red carpet welcome to him. And the funny part was, two mainstream parties, the BJP and the Congress, recognized that visit. Sonia Gandhi met the Israeli Prime Minister as leader of opposition. And that is what matters. At the end of the day, the largest political forces in the country had reached a position, there is a bipartisan consensus on Israel. And even the communist leaders visited Israel in 2000. So if you look at it, until the Intifada, which created much problems later on, you had a view in India, no matter what, bilateral relations is good for both countries. And that is how happened politically. And economic front, you had an enormous trade between the two countries. Still there is a scope. It stands at about $4 billion. If you look at it, at 1990, it was $80 million. From 80 to 4 billion, it's a huge leap, something no country has ever achieved in their bilateral relationship. The most interesting thing is happening where no country wants to talk about it, the military. As of March, Israel is India's largest arms exporter. Similarly, India is Israel's largest arms market. which is rather surprising, because in the Israeli case it's not surprising, because after 1980s, large number of markets have actually disappeared. Latin America, South Africa, Taiwan, for a whole range of issues, including China. So India becoming number one market in Israel is not a problem. The problem is the other way around, because 80% of India's defense establishment depends on the Russian model, number one. So to overtake Russia under those circumstances is not a joke. The second most interesting thing is Israel does not export platforms. No tanks, no missiles, no planes or ships. It is only avionics, small arms, missiles and other areas. In spite of the limitations, Israel has emerged India's largest arms supplier. So in that sense, that will tell you the ground reality. When it comes to military, even the sky is not the limit. We thought normally sky is the limit, even it looks like even that is not the case. Because in February last year, India launched a satellite of Israelis. And if you look at the media reports, everybody was very explicit. If and when Israel takes a military offensive against Iran, that satellite will be useful. India knew this, knowingly India launched it, which tells you that it is not only a cash and carry affair, you're willing to take the next logical step. Yes, if you're going to take my security into your account, I'm willing to do the same thing. I may not do everything you want, yes, but there are issues in which I could take that extra length and be counted on the subject. I think that is how the bilateral relations stand. But there is a flip side to that. The bilateral relations have increased over time. This has not changed India's basic position on the peace process. If you look at it, India has not abandoned the Palestinians. If you talk it, it's a two-state solution, Palestinian state, sovereignty, everything. If you look at a whole range of issues, refugees, border, fence, everything, Indian position is exactly opposite of the Israeli official position. There is no convergence of interest. If you look at the United Nations General Assembly, India still votes with the Arab majority, with the Palestinians. This is one of the major complaints Israel is making against India. You have a good relations, you have a close relation, but yet it is not transformed into much visibly in the General Assembly, other international forums. There was one exception, that was the Durban One. In spite of the public threat and pressure from the Arab countries, India simply said, we will not support your decision to equate Zionism with racism. We did it in 1975. We made amendments in 1991. We are not going to take the same course again. So in 2001, just days before the 9/11, India was not willing to support the Arabs on the Zionism demand. And that's a major departure from the past. In normal circumstances, India would have simply joined the hands. Will India do the same thing this time, this month? I'm not sure about it. My only gut feeling is that we will be so preoccupied with the elections, so nobody will have any time for the foreign affairs. That's the only thing one could think of. But what do I read it? At a bilateral level, India is prepared to have a solid relationship with Israel on every front, without exception. We are developing actually joint missile defense at an estimated cost of $2.5 billion. This is the largest defense deal India has ever signed. Single deal with any country in the world. And we are willing to cooperate with Israel across the board. You name the field, we will do it. But on the peace process, we have strong differences with Israel. I think this is what India is trying to do. There is a difference between bilateral relationship and the peace process. One is independent of the other. In 1939, the British came out with a white paper, and which more or less abandoned the Balfour Declaration. And the Zionist leadership in Palestine could not know what to do with that. They came out with a very fascinating strategy. Because that was a time when Hitler was on the rise, and you had to contain Hitler, and the only country which is containing Hitler was Britain, Churchill. So they came out with a statement. We will fight the war, that's the war in Europe, as if there is no white paper. And we will fight the white paper in Palestine as if there is no war in Europe. The same thing India is trying to do. We will support the bilateral relations as if there is no problem in the peace process. We will deal with the problem in the peace process as if there is no bilateral relations with the two other. And this is something India has been doing in the last 4 or 5 years. So from zero-sum game, you had a balance, and now you are getting into much more complex game. You are delinking the two and trying to have what I would call non-parallel interest. If only India is doing this, it's not a problem. As we said, India is not a major player in the Middle East. Okay, you do your own problem. Okay, we are not able to do that in Iran yet. Okay, India is trying to deal in the bilateral relationship and the peace process. What's the problem? Looking at things in the United States from India, I feel that Obama is going to do the same thing. Intensifying cooperation with Israel and even strengthening it over a period of time, but still disagreeing with Israel on the peace process. I think that is what India is trying to do. This perhaps is going to be the much visible face in the US policy towards the Middle East. Even though it's outside the purview, that is the only way India doing the same thing becomes relevant. Otherwise it's useless, because India is a marginal player. What India does it doesn't affect. But the idea is, when you look at Martin Indy's statement about the era of free checks is over, and that is why one reads it. But the good thing is, as a friend, as someone who wants to be a friend, things may not be said in public. Things will be said in a very subtle way, saying that is how I look at even the Indian behavior. In the sense, we don't say our disagreements much more visibly than in the past. If you look at even the Gaza statement, we were critical of Israel without mentioning a word about Qassam. We said, yes, both sides should accept ceasefire. Both sides should avoid targeting civilians. So which is a very subtle way. You can't say Hamas because of domestic compulsions. At the same time, you are no longer prepared to do this one-sided business which you are used to do in the past. This is how India, that is why I said, at one level, you are willing to engage with Israel. And on the peace process, you are willing to disengage. Thank you very much.